So our speaker now is Klaas Eller from the University of Amsterdam, who will be speaking on law, temporal governance, and acceleration in global value chains. And then we welcome back Anna Beckers to comment on the paper. So Klaas, you have 10 minutes and then we'll hear from Anna.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Shelley. Thanks, Hila and Guy, for the invitation. And so this is still a new and very tentative venture of mine, trying to think through the lens of time and temporal governance about GVCs in law. Hope to still make it some sort of academic just-in-time production. I have to apologize for ultimately being late and only able to submit some really preliminary and sketchy notes, and that also means that I'm all the more grateful to Anna for taking up the role as a commentator with a bit of an improvised setup. So as a starting point for this project, GVCs, I think, are as much about the flow of various materials across space as they are ultimately about temporal governance. So the idea of synchronizing and acceleration of time. Think of indeed just-in-time production that builds on lean inventories, drastic reduction of downtime in the workflow, and real-time demand-driven production. And another example that easily might come to mind would be fast fashion, a synonym for heavily accelerated production and consumption cycles in the clothing industry, where consumers are locked into ever-changing and very short-term production consumption cycles through new fashion trends. And then lastly, a third illustration could be a parallel dynamic that we see in financial markets, which, even though we often think of them as being somehow peripheral to GVCs, are actually central in dictating the speed and the rhythms of the economic activities that they invest into. And we can say that financial instruments ultimately commodify time itself and thereby have an important bearing on the speed with which GVCs operate. So through these examples, I think we can see that time is actually a productive factor and not just a neutral, passive outer frame for GVC relations. And with my paper, I hope to show, at least the way I currently think of it, that this temporal logic of GVCs is not just a question of management, of managerial practices, but actually intrinsically connected to law in many ways. If we take the perspective of the lead firm, we could say that law is, from that perspective, supposed to facilitate the intended timelines, both by centering private autonomy and also by ultimately cutting back on legal mechanisms that might hinder increased acceleration. If we switch perspective and turn to workers, we would say and see from empirical studies that short timelines, abrupt changes in order volume, delayed payments, and all these factors ultimately add to general volatility and low pay and other forms of vulnerability at the factory level. If we look beyond individual actors, from a wider perspective, bringing in time, I think we can see that value chains operate across and shape multiple temporalities. So think of season cycles in vegetables imposed by global north consumer markets, where then perishable goods are being rushed around the world in even tighter intervals to the final point of sale. And so oftentimes, what is behind global production is a kind of connection of conflicting temporalities, those that are on the one hand shaped by accelerating economic and legal arrangements in the global north, and those shaped by local practice, natural regeneration, workers' embeddedness in family ties, et cetera, in production countries, primarily in the global south. So one could say that value chains are some kind of prime example of how the global standardization of time actually operates to facilitate economic coordination while masking the de facto highly heterogeneous temporalities and also valuations of time at different sides of the global economy. And that's at least, I think, true in a historical perspective, where the very emergence actually of standardized time, the Greenwich Mean Time scheme in the late 19th century, was actually directly connected to synchronizing trade, communication, and transportation networks. And law already at the time was then the first to actually pick up on this by in contractual ordering, referring to this new standardized time for performance timelines, for payment schedules, etc., ultimately predicting or ensuring predictability of international transactions. So this idea of time and law intersecting and contract law in particular being relying on a certain type of temporality is something that accompanies us from the very beginning of standardized thinking about time since the late 19th century. So in this paper, I currently have basically three directions, and we'll have to see if all three make it to the final draft, but I would like to very briefly unpack three dimensions or levels that I think this temporal governance within GVCs speaks to. First, at the micro level, I think the power of a firm to coordinate the temporality of a value chain can actually add a new dimension to this interest in power dimensions and taxonomies of power in GVCs. Temporal governance, I would argue, actually compresses and intersects some other dimensions of power, some of which we've mentioned yesterday, and can be understood as a specific and tangible manifestation of such power dimensions. And that then connects to this recent interest in purchasing practices, where the focus is to argue that rather than solely checking compliance along the chain, big buyers actually, through their own activities, have a strong bearing on working conditions down the chain. And this is maybe most debated in the literature currently for the mechanism of price. But I think time is just as well, perhaps with slightly different nuances, a key contributor to pervasive purchasing practices and how they trickle down the value chain. If we take this micro perspective to the legal realm, then first we would be pointed to the mechanisms in contract and in corporate governance that actually support or restrain a lead firm's ability to set the pace and even to abruptly demand, for instance, an accelerated production. And if we look into international commercial contract law, for instance, we see that the Vienna Convention of Sales, just as an illustration for how basically I think the whole realm of transnational contract thinks about it, does subject delivery times to free arrangement between the parties. So private autonomy is the starting point, and then would require the seller to deliver within a reasonable time if there is no concrete specification in the contract, and the understanding of what is reasonable actually in court practice has very much already taken on board how quickly a consumer would want to see a certain product on the shelf and what are kind of seasonal cycles behind a certain product. And we also see that sanctions for late delivery by the seller can often be immensely costly, while actually the buyer, the big buyer, has little to fear beyond having to pay interest. A second legal connection of this first point would be to turn to, and connecting to Anna's presentation, to turn to the material infrastructures of production. Of course, ports, railway systems, flows of data, etc., have basically translated this idea of seamlessness of global value chains into material infrastructures, and that has become a normative argument in itself, in the sense that any type of disruption, any type of obstacle to this flow along infrastructures is seen as illegitimate and is seen as a disruption. We see this with worker strikes and recent climate protests, which deliberately try to use infrastructural bottlenecks of GVCs to actually delay and distort operations. And oftentimes the legal assessment of such protests, of such worker strategies, has been to show that basically the continuation and the speed and the maintenance of the flow along GVCs has in itself become a normative argument. Turning to my second point of the paper, a second level at which we could think about temporal governance here, would then try to bring this micro perspective that I started with in connection with the wider political economy of GVCs. The idea here would be that the drivers for speed, in a way, are not only coming from lead firms alone, but actually from capitalism's inherent tendency to engineer time, as Marx and many others have argued. And this would, I think, point us to legal levers that are oftentimes a bit more indirectly connected to GVC debates, or even outside of the debates that we commonly have. So consumer law and the law of advertising, where some of this consumption culture comes from, financial market regulation, rules on retail. So I'm thinking about shop opening hour regulation that have a strong temporal dimension, for instance. And perhaps most interestingly, in normative terms, the argument arises then if slowing down is a potential appealing regulatory strategy, and if that might be one way of actually trying to make sense of some of the instruments that we have currently. And I think slowing down as a regulatory strategy has certain overlaps with recent trends of nearshoring and disentangling and simplifying value chains that we see business actors anyway engaging with, but also regulators trying to set incentives for. But slowing down yet seems to add another perspective to this, namely ultimately to render visible the indirect effects, or what economic theory would understand as externalities, of high-paced production. And the difference seems to be that while nearshoring and these other strategies taken by lead firms basically aim at increasing the predictability of value chain structures from the perspective of the lead firm, a strategy of slowing down would reverse that story and would seek to make lead firm practices more predictable for the final tiers of the GVC. And I think we can take a few regulatory initiatives of recent times and wonder if they are perhaps connected to such a strategy of slowing down. So one could say that due diligence, if properly implemented, at least tries to give some breathing space for non-product related matters, a perspective which, if true, then might even go as far as to counter basically this critique of due diligence as being ahistorical and bracketing past wrongs and having this solely forward-looking perspective. So one could say, well, maybe the presentism of due diligence is actually part of its workings. The right to repair might come to mind here also as basically breaking and counteracting some of this linear extraction patterns of GVC. And perhaps one other example could be to think of model contract clauses that dictate how order adjustment and new timelines might be contractually regulated, for instance, mandating parties to basically learn from past experience. So trying to make sure that a seller does not get talked into or pushed into subscribing to unrealistic timelines that, from business experience is just utterly beyond what could be expected from that seller. And the third example, connecting again to Anna, would be to basically scrutinize the technological techniques that normalize acceleration. So the way how supply chain management interfaces would celebrate over hours or performance while being blind to the effects that this has. Coming to my last point and concluding then, so a third level at which I think temporal governance might be interesting to unpack would be that it allows a connection for legal analysis of GVCs to wider debates around temporalities in the Anthropocene, where we see environmental scholars growingly interested in how temporal narratives of past, present, and future are actually intertwined with legal mechanisms of resource exploitation and do actually take effect through law. And this then would raise questions of how temporal governance and value chains relates to something like nature's time and its regenerative capacities. If we look into how this is getting translated legally currently, I think we could think of debates around rights of future generations, or also the temporal planning logic that the Green Deal in both the EU and the US has, for instance, where we see that Green Deal policies often work with these midterm temporal goals, such as imposing on companies to set their own transition plans, or having governments develop their national climate transition plans, every time with a kind of mid-level time frame of 10 to 15 years within which certain changes have to occur. So these 3 points would be my again, very early intuitions on the work that time actually does in GVCs. And I can expand in the Q&A on where I hope this can go, but first really look forward to Anna's reactions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Over to you, Anna.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Klaas, for sort of putting these different thoughts out, because I think, so that would be my first comment. When this is written, this is going to be a fascinating paper, because I think there's also one of the parts that is a bit, or that is considerably neglected in the GVC literature, is that question on temporality, and the question on time. On the one hand, how do GVCs relate to time? And I think you made a very convincing case on where, on different levels of GVC analysis, micro, meso, governance, macro level, you do see time as a quite significant factor. And then on the other hand, or first and secondly, how law relates to all of this. So, and what the contribution of the law is to defining or influencing the time of GVCs. And I think this is, if you work out all of these aspects, I think it's also more than one paper, because I think this is a massive project in terms of centering another category beyond space, so that influences the way in which we structure organizations. So I'm very much looking forward to this. So I have structured this really more as a set of loose thoughts and comments to also maybe get the discussion started, ranging from sort of some concrete examples that I think you can use to sort of more broader questions that relate to what do you want to put the focus on in terms of that interaction between GVCs, law, and time. So starting maybe with that broader consideration, I think one of the things you might want to or need to consider when further working on this is sort of how are you using this triangle of law, temporality, and GVCs in your paper. I think one of the points that you stress is that GVCs and times are related, and there is a mode of acceleration, so time acceleration that is done in GVC governance. I think that's sort of one part of the discussion. And then when we relate law to that, there's different options in what you can do. And I think you're navigating in your initial thoughts a bit between, let's say, the constitutive role of the law in accelerating GVC time and the countermeasures or the possibilities, normative possibilities of slowing down time. So I think that's one dimension that you need to figure out, sort of, is this going to be a paper that shows us lawyers on how what temporal work law is doing and in terms of acceleration of time in GVCs? Or is this also a paper that looks at the potential of the law to interfere and intervene into time? The other aspect that I was thinking, and I think this relates a bit to your micro, meso, macro distinction, is of course the scale that you're using, to develop, to indicate and to determine time, So this is where I think this might be more than one paper, because I think the last question you pose about Anthropocene, and time in the Anthropocene and extractive mechanisms that sort of on a planetary scale give us a different temporality. You could also think of questions of coloniality, that are discussed in GVCs, which also put that temporal dimension into space. But that's sort of a very macro planetary understanding of time, which I think is very different to the micro level that you're discussing, which is about small instances of where time influences, is influential for certain power relations or for certain governance mechanisms in the chain in the shorter run. I think sort of these would be different projects, right? And then maybe sort of adding, let's say, with the concrete examples that I had or that came to my mind, when you discuss the sort of role of the law in accelerating time, I think this could be sort of a very concrete starting point that you also sort of can develop in one paper. No? So how does law accelerate or slow down time in GVCs very concretely? And I think you use very well sort of outline already the mechanisms, no, the underpinning of GVCs through contracts and how contracts and contract law is doing, let's say, temporal work, no, through delivery times, etc. I think one of the examples that you could use very concretely is so that to say that it's not only, let's say, contract law, but also the contracts and the private autonomy underpinning it is, I think, with the corona pandemic, no, where you had exactly this sort of allowance of like stopping and accelerating through framework agreements in contracts between buyers and suppliers that allowed the buyer to like stop and then accelerate when and place orders when they wanted to. So that just as a concrete example. And I think this can help for shaping and shaping your critique on the law and on what work contract law does in terms of accelerating time. But then I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned at the end sort of the regulatory work and the normative, let's say, counter tendencies that you could use here. And I was wondering whether you might want to make that point also stronger, no? Because of course you can tell there's a potential to tell a story about contract law being, let's say, empowering the lead firms on a temporal basis and allowing sort of power to be used increasingly by lead firms. So that could be one part of the story, but there are, of course, restrictions to that. No? And I think you mentioned due diligence legislation as now having all these discussions about responsible procurement practices, no? So, and whether delivery is also one of the aspects that might need to come into that. Another aspect would be unfair trading practices, no? Where also you don't have, let's say, a strong focus on delivery periods, for instance, but you do have a discussion on, let's say, when do you have to pay, no? So what is an unfair practice if you pay too late after the delivery, no, which also puts a temporal dimension into it. So I think there your paper might need to sort of see where do you set the tone, no, and do you want to sort of write more a paper on how law contributes to acceleration, or also what are the counter tendencies and the normative inroads. And then I was thinking on let's say your meso level on let's say structuring GVC governance, no, where I find it quite interesting to see when you look into GVC laws through that lens. So, for instance, due diligence, but also these sort of reshoring, resilience strategies that are out by different governments to get, let's say, resilient value chains, on whether there's not a potential to move even a little deeper into these laws. So just an example that came to my mind on due diligence. Now, yesterday, having had the press conference and the proposal by the Commission on watering down due diligence requirements, I think there you could also add another dimension of time, no? Because one of the aspects that was stressed in the changes now is that this is overburdening companies on the like due diligence requirements are overburdening the companies on the temporal level, and one of the consequences that the Commission now has been taken from this is to say maybe we need to, let's say, postpone the cycle and companies only reporting every 5 years, no? So where you have a slowing down of time, but not in the way that you were thinking, or no, so that you were thinking normatively in terms of slowing down time. So that was another thought I had, where I also thought, and that's getting back maybe to my initial point, how much I really enjoyed this temporal dimension, because I think it makes us look at GVC laws and GVC governance in a very different way, which is very enriching on understanding how time produces and relates to power. So I would have a lot more, but I think I'll leave it at that in light of time, because I also want to get the discussion started on what
Thank
others have.
you. Thank you so much, Anna. Klaas, please go ahead and respond first of all, and then we'll take comments and questions from others. And I can already see 2 hands up.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, really, really grateful to Anna for doing this on short notice, as I know, because I've been so late, and doing it nonetheless in such an inspiring manner. Like before, I took a lot of notes, and I think I completely take from you the urge to be selective, and in that sense, it's very much still a collection of material, and that there are in fact 2 different papers, between the one that would focus on stressing the constitutive role of law as an accelerator, and the perhaps, in Roy's terminology, more hopeful version of a law that looks for solutions of slowing down, and perhaps these 2 don't have to be in the same paper. And I think the CSDDD point from yesterday to make due diligence no longer a continuous practice, but actually one that has 5-year intervals. I mean, how much is 5 years in that fast-paced reality of GVCs? It's insane as a suggestion, I find, completely stripping it of its meaning. But it's a very good illustration, I think, of the point. Maybe I leave it at this and look forward to the other remarks.
Great. Well, let's take Rebecca first, and then Isi, and then we'll come back to you, Klaas. Rebecca.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Klaas, for this very clear also presentation, in the light that you didn't present a paper yet. I agree with Anna that also just I didn't introduce myself yesterday, but I work with Anna in her ERC project at Maastricht, just to present myself. So I agree with Anna that what you're outlined here is very interesting. And I just thought of an additional layer that perhaps you can also evaluate whether integrating or not. On the temporal dimension of impacts. So just to connect again GVCs to their original literature, more inspired to law and development studies. So I think that this the temporal management and the temporal governance also affects the temporal impact that GVCs produce on different nodes. And so, for instance, in the garment industry, you have negative impacts that tend to have a long temporal dimension, and positive impacts that are much shorter. And so it can be interesting to notice how these technicalities have different temporal impacts on different actors or in different sectors. So just to align this. So, I mean, yes, it was just my thought, and I would be glad to know what you think of it.
Thank you, Isi.
Thank you, Klaas. It was a really fascinating presentation, and what's going to be a great paper. I want to comment on the second paper, the paper about the regulatory kind of correction to the acceleration, and ask you about the cultural dimension, whether we haven't, the train have left the train long time ago. And here I have an anecdote that I thought about when you were presenting. I visited my daughter in Washington, D.C. just, a couple of weeks ago. They had a baby, and the diaper, they were out of diapers. So I said, okay, so let's go to the, to the grocery, to the supermarket to buy. No, we're ordering in Amazon. And I realized that they expect, and that's what happens, that every order will come at the same day. If it's too late, the next day in the morning maximum. So this is what is expected now by consumers, that everything will, be at their doors rapidly. So I don't know if, slowing by regulatory kind of measures is even possible.
Shelley, should I sorry, I think you're muted.
Sorry, go ahead and respond, Klaas. Sorry.
Thanks, Issy and Rebecca. Let me start with Rebecca. Great point. I think this idea of temporal impacts not coinciding for different communities is super important indeed. Was also an intuition already in drafting it, but it would be good to connect this to clear examples, because one could even now take this idea of the CSDDD yesterday for the 5 years intervals and basically show how certain types of supply chain wrongs will then just by nature fall through the cracks because there may be more short-paced, whilst others might have much longer timelines and just never really materialize within the reporting periods. We see that as well with transparency regimes along value chains. So to make the case that basically these reporting and responsibilizing intervals that we have in the different regulatory mechanisms need to be attuned to the different temporalities in which impacts manifest themselves, would I think be a strong point, and it might even actually cast some doubt for this obsession with double materiality in financial reporting, sustainability reporting, with the idea that things would at the same time manifest themselves as a financial risk to the company, which has a very different timeline, and as a risk to wider society, where I think your point is spot on to say maybe these two impacts just hardly ever occur at the same time. So I'll have to see how to take this further, but a very generative point. And Issy, totally on board that we need to think about consumption culture as a very deeply rooted cultural phenomenon, of course. And then as lawyers, I think we way too little try to indeed think of how law supports also this cultural dimension of production and consumption culture. So that would get us indeed into rules on advertising. If I think of all the crypto world now that comes with its own iconography and all the kind of cultural allure that Trump and that Musk and others erect around the world of crypto, I think a promising legal regulation basically has to make that kind of cultural illusion built around it somehow burst, and that doesn't work through command and control and conventional ways of thinking about law, but has to really take this cultural connotation very seriously. My hope would be that tendencies like we see in slow food, slow fashion, that these can at least become kind of big enough to demystify a little bit this impression that we might all have that the delivery has to come tomorrow and otherwise it's the end of the world. So that at some point we get to a realization that time is much less of an essence than companies and markets want to make us believe.
We have about 3 minutes left.
I think it would have been really nice if you'll be on tomorrow, and Meital will be on tomorrow. She's an expert on fast fashion, and she has a lot to say about the potential of going slow and about the ways to go there. So she would be a great address for this discussion.
Great. I think rather than taking any further questions, we'll just thank Klaas and Anna, and then Hilla, do